He thought he was about to expose Donald Trump, but instead Melania took the mic and exposed him. What happened next sent shockwaves across the internet. The bright red live sign flickered on, illuminating the studio in an electrifying glow. The audience settled into their seats, murmurs of anticipation spreading like wildfire. This wasn't just another segment. It was the segment. Tonight, America was watching. At the sleek glass table, Brian Lasker, the nation's most outspoken liberal host, adjusted his tie and leaned forward, his fingers laced together like a man preparing to strike. His network had been teasing this moment for days, promising a deep dive into the latest Trump scandal. The ratings were expected to be astronomical. Tonight, Brian's voice cut through the low hum of conversation, we're bringing you an unfiltered, uncensored look at the most shocking revelation about Donald Trump yet. The crowd erupted. Applause, cheers, a few scattered boos. Brian welcomed them all with a knowing smile. Controversy fueled his career, and tonight he was throwing gasoline on the fire. Somewhere across the city in a penthouse suite, Melania Trump sat in a high-backed chair, watching the broadcast unfold. The large flat-screen television dominated the modern living room, casting a harsh glow against the pristine white walls. She had seen these segments before. Brian had made a name for himself attacking her husband. Nothing new, but something felt different tonight. Melania's fingers tightened around her wine glass. Her hair, styled in soft waves, framed a face that remained unreadable. She had mastered the art of restraint, perfected the neutral expression. But inside something was shifting. On the screen, Brian continued, let's cut the nonsense. We all know Donald Trump thrives on controversy, but this latest revelation, even his most die-hard supporters might have a hard time defending him now. A graphic flashed across the screen, bold letters filling the space. Exposed, the truth about Trump. Melania's lips pressed into a thin line. The audience roared. Brian let the moment linger, soaking in the tension. He was a performer as much as he was a journalist, and he knew exactly how to manipulate a crowd. This isn't about policies. This isn't about party lines, he continued, his voice dropping into a hushed, almost conspiratorial tone. This is about a man who has lied to the American people. Again, the camera zoomed in, emphasizing the gravity of his words. Melania exhaled slowly. This was what she had expected. More accusations, more cherry-picked sound bites, clips stripped of context, headlines crafted for maximum outrage. Brian turned to his guest, a former Trump insider now turned critic, a man Melania once shared dinners with, who had smiled at her across long mahogany tables, acting like a friend. Now he was here to sell his story. It's worse than we thought, the guest said gravely. The crowd hushed. Melania's nails tapped against the glass in her hand. Trump knew about this. He orchestrated it. The words landed like a hammer. Melania stiffened. She didn't even know what this was yet, but the audacity of it made her pulse quicken. She wasn't naive. She knew what her husband was capable of, his brashness, his calculated chaos, but she also knew the media. She knew how men like Brian spun narratives, how they fed the public a script carefully written to create outrage. And tonight they had chosen her husband as the villain. Again. The audience gasped. A flurry of reactions hit social media in real time. The hashtags started trending. Hashtag Trump exposed. Hashtag lies uncovered. Melania silence speaks. Melania's jaw tensed. She wasn't a woman prone to outbursts. Her entire public image was built on control, on elegance, on carefully measured words. But tonight, something felt different. She leaned forward, reaching for the remote, the screen reflected in her icy blue eyes. Brian was still talking, the audience eating up every word. Ladies and gentlemen, this might just be the moment that changes everything. Melania exhaled. She could sit here and watch, like she always did. She could let the narrative spin out of control. Let the world once again define her husband, define her, without her voice. Or she could do something about it. Her fingers hovered over the phone beside her. A single call could change the course of this night, and for the first time in a long time, Melania felt the urge to break the silence. But was she ready for what would come next? Melania didn't move for a moment. The phone sat beside her, motionless, waiting. Was she really considering this? On the screen, Brian's voice cut through the chatter of the crowd. "We have exclusive documents," he said, tapping a thick folder on the desk for effect. "Undeniable proof that Trump has, once again, deceived the American people." The camera zoomed in, dramatizing the moment. The audience leaned forward. Social media was already spiraling, hashtags multiplying by the second. Melania's grip on the remote tightened. She had spent years watching the headlines twist reality, watching so-called insiders sell their stories, watching the world form an opinion about her husband, her family, her marriage without ever knowing the full truth. She should ignore it. That was always the safest move. But Brian's voice kept pushing. "Now, before we reveal this, let's talk about what this means for Melania Trump," he continued, leaning back with an almost smug expression. "For years, people have wondered, how much does she really know? How much does she really care?" The crowd chuckled. "She stands by him, stone-faced, no matter the scandal, no matter the lies." He turned to his guest, the former Trump insider, with a smirk. "Tell me, do you think she actually believes him? Or is she just playing her part?" Melania felt something hot rise in her chest. The guest exhaled dramatically, as if this question had weighed on his soul. "I don't think she has a choice," he said. "I think she's trapped." The audience gasped. The word hung in the air. Trapped. Melania stared at the screen, stunned for a moment. Trapped. As if she were some puppet, some weak, submissive woman with no agency, no control over her own life. They didn't know her. They didn't know the nights she'd spent strategizing with her husband, the fierce loyalty that burned beneath her quiet exterior. They didn't know the sacrifices, the calculated moves, the way she had learned to navigate a world where every action, every breath was analyzed, criticized, dissected. And now, this man, this traitor who once sat at her dinner table, had the audacity to speak on her behalf. Brian turned back to the camera, sensing the energy in the room. He was on a roll now. "Melania, if you're watching," he said with a mocking smile, "blink twice if you need help." The crowd erupted in laughter, and something inside Melania snapped. She grabbed her phone. The screen glowed in the dimly lit room as she scrolled to the number she never thought she'd dial under these circumstances, a direct line to the network. She hesitated for only a second. Then she pressed call. Back in the studio, Brian was still reveling in the laughter. He thrived on moments like these, when the power was firmly in his hands, when the audience ate from the palm of his hand. Then, in his earpiece, a producer's voice cut through the noise. Brian, you're not going to believe this." Brian barely looked up, still smirking. "Try me." The producer hesitated. Then, "Melania Trump is on the phone." Live. Silence. The laughter in the audience faded as Brian's expression shifted. "Wait. What?" The control room buzzed with sudden chaos. "She's on the line right now. She wants to speak." For the first time that night, Brian looked genuinely thrown. This wasn't supposed to happen. Melania never responded to media attacks. She was the silent, untouchable figure, the mystery. And yet, here she was. A slow grin crept across his face. This was a gift. "Patch her through," he said smoothly, sitting up straighter. His fingers curled against the table, eyes gleaming with anticipation. He turned back to the camera, his voice smooth, practiced. "Well, ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have a very special guest joining us tonight." The audience hushed. Even the former Trump insider looked uneasy. Brian pressed a button on the sleek control panel in front of him. The line clicked. "Melania Trump," he said, voice dripping with amusement. "You're live on air." A beat of silence. Then, her voice. Calm, cool, sharp as a blade. "You should be careful what you say about people you don't know, Brian." The audience gasped. But that was just the beginning. The silence in the studio stretched, heavy and unexpected. Brian Lasker, always quick with a comeback, opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time that night, he wasn't in control. Melania's voice, sharp and steady, cut through the air like a blade. You should be careful what you say about people you don't know, Brian. Her tone was measured, but there was no mistaking the warning beneath it. Brian recovered quickly, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Melania Trump, ladies and gentlemen," he said, spreading his arms wide. The audience chuckled, though a few looked genuinely intrigued. This was new. This was unexpected. This was a woman who had never called in to defend her husband before. "Melania," Brian continued, keeping his voice smooth, controlled. "I have to admit, I didn't expect you to call in tonight. You usually let your husband's scandals speak for themselves." A few chuckles from the crowd. Melania didn't laugh. "I called," she said, "because you're sitting there, playing judge and jury, acting as if you know my marriage, my life. But you don't." Her accent, usually soft and controlled, had an edge to it tonight. The murmurs in the audience grew louder. Brian's smirk didn't falter. If anything, he looked amused. "All right, I'll bite. Since you're here, tell me. Do you support what your husband has done?" Silence. A pause just long enough to make everyone lean forward. Then, "You assume I'm calling to explain my husband's choices," Melania said, her voice smooth, unhurried. "I'm not." Brian blinked. She continued, "I'm calling because I'm tired of men like you pretending to care about women while using us as punchlines in your performances." The audience shifted. Something in Brian's expression flickered, just for a second. Then he laughed. Too loudly. A practiced, dismissive laugh. "Melania," he said, shaking his head, "no one is using you as a punchline. We're discussing real issues, real corruption. If that makes you uncomfortable—" "What makes me uncomfortable," she interrupted, her voice sharper now, "is the way you sit there, night after night, pretending you care about justice when all you really want is a headline." The audience reacted. Brian's smirk faltered for half a second, but he wasn't done yet. "You're upset because we're exposing the truth," he countered, leaning forward now. "If your husband is innocent, why are you so angry?" Another pause. Then Melania laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not a forced one. A low, knowing, almost amused laugh. Brian's expression darkened. "You think I'm angry?" she asked. "I'm not angry. I'm entertained." Now the audience was really leaning in. Brian had expected defensiveness, rage, maybe even silence. What he hadn't expected was this. "What's entertaining about being exposed?" he challenged, his grip tightening on the desk. "The way you act like you're fearless," Melania said simply. "Like you're some great truth seeker, a man who stands up to power." Her voice dipped, colder now. "But the truth is, you only go after people when it's safe." Brian's smirk disappeared. "You attack people the media already hates. You say what your audience wants to hear, so they'll keep clapping for you." The crowd was silent now. "You're not brave, Brian," Melania finished. "You're predictable." For the first time that night, Brian had no immediate comeback. The audience murmured, shifting in their seats. Melania let the silence hang for a moment, then added, just softly enough to feel like a final blow, "You call me trapped, but I think we both know who's really stuck in a role they can't escape." Brian's jaw tensed. The cameras kept rolling. Social media was already on fire, but the night wasn't over yet. Because Brian Lasker wasn't about to let Melania Trump have the last word. The tension in the studio was palpable. The audience, once lively and engaged, now sat in stunned silence. Even those who despised Donald Trump, who came here tonight to watch his name get torn apart, couldn't deny what was happening. Melania Trump had just done something no one expected. She had flipped the script. Brian Lasker, ever the seasoned performer, was not about to lose control of his own show. He forced a smile, shaking his head. "Well, Melania, I have to say, you're a lot more talkative when you're not standing next to your husband." A few scattered chuckles from the audience, but they weren't laughing as freely now. Melania's voice remained calm, steady, and you're a lot less confident when someone challenges you directly. Brian's fingers tapped against the desk. The control room was frantically buzzing in his earpiece, his producer urging him to take back control. But how? He had invited the storm, and now he was standing in the middle of it. "All right," Brian said, leaning in, shifting tactics. "You want to talk about bravery? Let's talk." Melania didn't say anything. She was letting him work. Brian seized the opening. You call me predictable, but let's be real. You're the one playing a role. The silent, elegant wife. The woman who smiles and waves while standing next to a man accused of... He cut himself off, but the implication hung in the air. Melania let out a slow breath. Then she spoke. You assume I am defending my husband. A pause. I am defending myself. Brian blinked. That was not the answer he expected. Melania continued, her voice smooth, deliberate. You sit here and tell people I am trapped, that I am playing a role, that I am too weak to speak. She tilted her head slightly. And yet here I am, speaking. The audience shifted. I wonder, Melania added, how much you would like it if I started making assumptions about your wife. Brian's smirk vanished. The room felt smaller. Melania's voice remained soft but firm. You talk about me like I am not a person, like I am an accessory in a man's story. She paused just long enough to let the weight of that land. And yet, you would never allow someone to talk about your wife that way. Would you? Brian's jaw tightened. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable. The audience was watching him now, not as the fearless journalist, but as a man suddenly being confronted with his own hypocrisy. You claim to support women, Melania continued, but only the ones who agree with you. Only the ones who fit your narrative. Another pause. And that is why you do not like me. Brian opened his mouth, but no words came out. The audience had gone silent. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to control the conversation. He was supposed to be the one exposing contradictions. Yet here he was, being picked apart on his own stage. And he knew it. Melania, on the other hand? She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She was simply waiting. She had said what she needed to say, and now Brian had to decide how to respond. But the problem with men like Brian Lasker, they never know when to stop. The next move was his. The silence in the studio stretched just a second too long. Brian Lasker, always quick on his feet, looked caught between two choices. He could pivot, brush this off, regain control, or he could double down. He chose the latter. Brian forced a smirk, though it didn't reach his eyes. All right, Melania, he said, voice tight but still playing for the cameras. You want to make this about me? Fine, but let's not forget why we're here. He grabbed the folder on his desk, lifting it for effect. The American people deserve answers. Your husband has lied again and again, and you, whether you like it or not, have stood by him every step of the way. He flipped the folder open, glancing at his notes. So, let me ask you something. Do you actually believe everything he says? Or do you just pretend to? A loaded question. A trap. The audience leaned forward. Brian sat back, his smirk creeping back into place. He thought he had her now. But Melania? She didn't hesitate. I believe, she said, that you don't care about the truth. Only about headlines. Brian's smirk flickered. The audience let out a collective ooh. Melania's voice remained calm, steady. Too steady. You act like this is about facts. But we both know, if the truth was on my side, you wouldn't let it air. Brian scoffed. Oh, please. She didn't let him interrupt. I watch the way you cover stories, she continued. You don't report, you perform. Brian's fingers curled against the table. And you are not upset that my husband lies, she added. You are upset that his lies are more powerful than yours. The audience gasped. Brian's face darkened. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because what was he supposed to say to that? For the first time in his career, his usual playbook wasn't working. Melania Trump, the woman who was supposed to be cold, calculated, distant, submissive, was sitting here, dissecting him like a surgeon. Brian had spent years ripping people apart. But tonight, he was the one being peeled open. The audience could feel it. The control room could feel it. And the internet? Oh, it had already exploded. Tweets were flying. The live stream comments were flooding in. Did Melania just body Brian on his own show? This was not the plan. She's unshaken. This is insane. I don't even like Trump, but damn, she's got a point. Brian's earpiece buzzed. His producer, nervous now, changed the subject, regain control, wrap it up. Brian gritted his teeth. Melania sat in silence, waiting. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't panicking. She had said what she needed to say, and the longer the silence stretched, the worse it got. For Brian. Because now, everyone was watching him struggle. The audience wasn't looking at Melania as a trapped wife anymore. They were looking at Brian as a cornered man. And that was not a position he was used to being in. He exhaled sharply, forcing another laugh. "Well, Melania," he said, sitting up straighter, regaining his showman voice. "That was interesting." A chuckle from the audience, but it felt forced now. "Tell your husband we'll be seeing him in court," Brian added, throwing a final jab. Melania exhaled softly. Then she hung up. Click. The line went dead. The studio was silent. And for the first time in his career, Brian Lasker had nothing left to say. But outside the studio, the world was already reacting. The studio remained eerily quiet. The audience, once eager to clap at Brian's every word, now sat uncertain, exchanging glances. It was as if they were waiting for permission to react. Brian Lasker, the man who had built a career on shaping narratives, now sat in front of the cameras, exposed. He had lost control. His earpiece buzzed again, this time more urgent. His producer's voice cut through the silence. "We're in damage control. Move on. Fast." Brian forced a tight smile, masking his irritation. He turned to the camera. "Well," he said, with a forced chuckle. "That was unexpected." A few scattered laughs. "Weak. She called in," he continued, grasping for control. "She said her piece. But let's be honest. Did she really answer anything?" A couple of audience members clapped. Too few. Brian's grip on the desk tightened. He felt it now. The shift. This was supposed to be a segment that dominated headlines for all the right reasons. A takedown. Another viral moment solidifying him as a fearless journalist. Instead, Melania had flipped the entire narrative. He could already see the clips spreading across the internet. The headlines weren't about Trump anymore. They were about him. On social media, the explosion had already begun. Brian Lasker just got schooled on his own show. Melania handed him his own script and made him read it out loud. Not a Trump fan, but she made some points. This wasn't supposed to happen. Wow. The comments flooded in, split between those who still cheered Brian on and those who had just witnessed something they couldn't quite explain. Because whatever people thought about Donald Trump, tonight wasn't about him. Tonight was about Melania. And for the first time, people saw her not as the silent wife, not as a passive figure, but as something else entirely. Meanwhile, inside Melania's penthouse, the glow of the television flickered against her face. The show had moved on. Brian was already on to another segment, his voice forced, tight, trying to sound in control again. Melania wasn't watching anymore. Her phone was already vibrating. Texts, calls, some from people she hadn't spoken to in years, some from White House aides, likely scrambling to gauge whether they needed to put out a statement. She ignored them. Instead, she reached for the remote and turned the TV off. For years, she had sat quietly. Let them talk. Let them spin their stories. But tonight she had spoken for herself. And the world was listening. But the question remained, what would happen next? The city lights stretched endlessly beyond Melania's penthouse windows, casting a faint glow across the sleek modern space. For the first time in a long time, the silence felt different. Not the silence of restraint, not the silence of endurance, but the silence of something shifting. Her phone vibrated again. Another call. Another text. She didn't check who it was. She already knew. On the other side of town, in the newsroom's war room, Brian Lasker was pacing. His producer was firing off commands. Staffers were glued to screens, tracking live reactions. "What's the damage?" Brian demanded. A junior staffer, pale and hesitant, cleared his throat. Trending topics aren't going the way we expected." Brian frowned. Meaning? The staffer swallowed. Sir, it's not Trump people are talking about. It's you. The room was silent. Brian's jaw tightened. Across the country, people were watching the viral clips, reading the threads, dissecting every word. She didn't panic. She didn't stumble. She didn't break. Why is it that the people who claim to fight for women only respect the ones who agree with them? Maybe we don't know Melania Trump as well as we thought. Say what you want. But she put Brian in a corner and left him there. Even pundits on rival networks, ones that had never been kind to Melania, were acknowledging the moment. She did something rare, one commentator admitted. She flipped the power dynamic. She didn't act like a victim. She didn't crumble under pressure. She made Brian look small. The host across from him sighed. And the worst part? He did it to himself. Back at the penthouse, Melania finally picked up her phone. Not to read the texts, not to scroll social media, but to call one person. The line rang once, twice, then, "Melania!" Donald Trump's voice came through, his tone unreadable. Silence stretched between them for a moment. Then he let out a chuckle. "I saw the show." She said nothing. "You did good," he added, his voice laced with something he rarely admitted. Pride. She still didn't respond. Not because she needed his approval, but because for the first time, she didn't need anyone's. She had spoken, and the world had listened. This moment wasn't just about politics. It wasn't about Trump or Brian Lasker or the media machine. It was about perception, power, about how easy it is to assume who someone is when they say nothing at all. Melania had been silent for years. People took that silence and wrote their own story for her, until she wrote her own. And maybe that's the lesson in all of this. The world will always try to define you. They will make assumptions, spin narratives, paint pictures that fit their agenda. But at the end of the day, only you get to decide what your silence really means. So when the time comes, will you let others tell your story, or will you take the microphone and tell it yourself? If you enjoyed this, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. What do you think? Did Melania finally reveal the side of herself the world has never seen? Let us know below.